The first thing people noticed that winter wasn't Elias Harrow's cabin. It was the smoke above it. In the Bitterroot Range, January smoke was supposed to rise in heavy, desperate columns, thick enough to stain the air and tell the valley just how hard a man was fighting the cold. But the smoke drifting from Elias's chimney looked wrong. It barely lifted at all, thin, pale, lazy, like a man simmering stew on a spring morning rather than battling a mountain winter that had already reached 40 below. To the other trappers scattered across the valley, it could only mean one thing: Elias must be freezing in there. Everyone else was burning through their winter wood piles faster than they dared admit. Men were waking before dawn to cut frozen logs by lantern light hands, numb breaths turning to crystals in the dark. But Elias, his stacks of lodgepole pine barely shrank. Every man who passed his place stared at the tidy pile with something between suspicion and irritation. A few muttered that he'd crack and come begging for wood before February. But inside that weather-beaten cabin, something very different was happening. Elias Harrow, quiet, stubborn, slow to speak, and even slower to brag, had built something no one else in the valley had imagined. Not a new stove, not better insulation, not some strange fuel from back east. He had built a wall beneath the wall, a hidden structure sunk deep into the earth, tapping a kind of warmth older than any homestead, older than the frontier itself. While the valley fought the cold with axes and sweat, Elias fought it with observation, with memory, with the kind of knowledge a man only gains from a life spent paying attention to the small, quiet truths of the land. And on that brutal winter morning, as thin smoke drifted upward and the neighbors whispered about his stupid method, Elias leaned back in his chair boots, stretched toward a modest evening fire. His cabin warm enough that frost never formed on the inside of the window. He wasn't rationing his wood. He simply didn't need much of it. In the winter country of the early Rockies, heat wasn't comfort. It was survival. Every man who settled in the Bitterroot Valley understood that a cabin wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was a lifeboat floating in an ocean of cold that could swallow a person whole if he made even one mistake. Most trappers built their winter cabins the same way: thick lodgepole logs, a stone hearth, moss-chinked seams to keep the wind out. It was a design borrowed from generations of frontier hands, and it worked. But only if a man fed it an unending stream of firewood. A typical trapper burned through 4, sometimes 5 cords each winter. That meant months of cutting, hauling, splitting, stacking, and praying the pile would last until the thaw. The work wasn't optional. You cut wood or you froze, simple as that. The rhythm of valley life in winter reflected this truth. Axes rang before dawn. Smoke plumed from every chimney in heavy gray strokes. Men kept tally of their wood piles the way soldiers count ammunition. They knew exactly how fast their stacks shrank, and they worried each time a cold front rolled down from the high ridges. But Elias Harrow lived slightly outside that rhythm. He wasn't careless or lazy, no mountain man could afford to be. But he had always been the sort who questioned the edges of what others accepted. While his neighbors treated winter like an enemy that had to be beaten back hour by hour, Elias treated it like a puzzle, a system, something that might have a weakness if a man paid enough attention. And he did pay attention. He noticed how quickly a cabin cooled the moment a fire died, even if the hearth had been roaring minutes earlier. He noticed how the wood in a root cellar stayed unfrozen while the snow outside turned brittle and hard as iron. He remembered with surprising clarity the subterranean stillness of the old farm he'd helped dig as a boy in Missouri. How even on the coldest days, the bottom of that well never froze. These little observations lodged in Elias's mind like seeds beneath winter soil, quiet, unremarkable, but waiting for the right conditions to grow. To the typical trapper, heating was a race, a brutal sprint fought with sweat-sore backs and endless cords of pine. But to Elias, the race itself seemed strange. Why, he wondered, should survival depend on burning half the forest just to stay warm? Why did a cabin have to lose heat so fast when the ground beneath it stayed steady and calm, no matter how cruel the air turned? He didn't voice these thoughts. Mountain men weren't known for philosophical conversations. But the questions lingered, and each winter storm carved them deeper into his thinking. Because the truth was simple: if a man could keep heat without exhausting himself, without gambling his life on the size of his woodpile, then the very nature of winter living would change. Comfort would no longer be a luxury. Survival would no longer be a race. A cabin would become not a battlefield against the cold, but a partner with the land it stood on. Most men never asked those questions. Elias did. And that difference, quiet as a whisper in a storm, would eventually set him apart from every trapper in the valley. Elias Harrow had never called himself an inventor. Men of the frontier didn't use words like that. They weren't building machines or writing patents. They were just trying to stay alive. But every once in a while, a moment arrives in a man's life when all the scattered pieces of his past quietly click together. For Elias, that moment began with something so ordinary that most men walked past it without a second thought of the earth itself. Long before he ever set foot in the Rockies, Elias had grown up on a hard-scrabble patch of farmland along the Missouri River. His father wasn't a wealthy man, but he had a stubborn streak of self-reliance. When a drought nearly ruined their crops one summer, he insisted on digging a new well by hand rather than paying someone else to do it. Elias was only 12, but he remembered that well. Like it was yesterday, the cool, still air at the bottom, even when the sun above baked the fields to cracking dust. That memory returned to him decades later as he chipped away at a root cellar behind his cabin. It was early November, the kind of cold that bites your fingers even through gloves. Outside, the world was turning to stone, but 8 feet down, the potatoes he stored were cool, not frozen. His breath misted in the cellar, yet the walls were damp instead of icy. Even stranger, the temperature barely changed from day to day. He tested the idea further carefully privately because mountain men weren't the sort to share half-formed thoughts. One morning, when surface frost glittered like crushed glass, he lowered a candle into the cellar. The flame bent not sharply, but just enough for a man who pays attention to notice. Warm air rising, cold air settling. A slow, steady breath of the earth itself. Most men in the valley treated their root cellars as simple storage holes. Elias saw something else, a natural reservoir of steadiness. A place where the chaos of winter lost its power. And more importantly, a place where heat behaved differently than it did in the open air. He remembered how deep mine shafts back in Missouri always stayed near 50 degrees, no matter how snow piled up outside. He remembered how earth walls felt warm in winter and cool in summer. He remembered the old trapper's joke that the ground don't care what month it is. The ground doesn't care. Those words stayed with him. While other men cursed the cold and piled more logs onto their sleds, Elias found himself kneeling beside his cellar fingers, pressed into the cool dirt, imagining what lay another 10, 15, 20 feet beneath him. The temperature there, how steady would it be? Could a man use that steadiness? Could a cabin be warmed not by fighting winter, but by leaning on something older and quieter? Those questions settled inside him like sparks waiting for kindling. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridges that evening, Elias wasn't just thinking about surviving the next storm. He was thinking about how the ground had been holding a secret under everyone's feet. A secret that might change everything about how a man heats a cabin. And though he didn't yet know the shape of the idea, he felt it beginning to form slowly, quietly, just like warmth rising through deep earth. Once a thought takes root in a mountain man's mind, it grows the same way a pine does on a rocky ledge, slowly at first, then all at once. By early spring, Elias Harrow's idea had stopped being a curiosity and started becoming a plan. Not a tunnel like the old miners built. Not a hidden stove. Something simpler. Something sturdier. Something that used the earth exactly the way the earth wanted to be used. It began with the north wall of his cabin, the side that faced the longest shadows, the coldest winds, and the harshest nights. Most trappers dreaded their north wall. Elias studied his. He imagined heat as if it were a living thing, flooding into the room, sinking toward the floor, pooling in the corners. Then he imagined where that heat wanted to escape. Always toward the coldest surface. Always toward that north wall. So he asked himself the question no one else bothered to ask. What if the coldest wall could be turned into the warmest? Which is how he ended up spending nearly 3 months carving a deep recess along the entire length of that wall, a trench just inside the cabin footprint, about 3 feet wide, cutting straight down into the earth. He dug until the soil grew cold and still, until the smell of frozen loam filled the air like damp iron. 10 feet, 15 feet, 20. It was backbreaking work done quietly alone, without brag or announcement. Most men would have stopped there. Elias kept going. At the bottom of that trench, he began stacking stones, flat river stones, hauled one brutal bag at a time from the creek. He placed them with such care that they locked together like old masonry. Behind the stones, he packed a mixture of earth and clay, forming a tall, thick, zigzagging surface that looked less like a wall and more like the spine of some prehistoric creature asleep beneath the cabin. This was the beginning of his subwall. Unlike a tunnel which aimed to move air horizontally from a distant pit, Elias's design relied on vertical convection. It created a hidden chamber, narrow, tall, and always touching the deep soil where temperatures stayed steady year-round. The more surface area that wall had, the more heat could move through it. So he shaped it in ridges and steps angles, and folds, each one increasing the contact between air and earth. Above it, at floor level, he left a slit just a few inches wide, running the entire length of the cabin's north side. It was barely noticeable, nothing a visitor would pay attention to. But it was enough to let cold, heavy cabin air fall into the chamber below. At the bottom of the chamber, he carved a small vent leading upward, angled so that air warmed by deep earth would rise naturally back into the cabin through another opening near the hearth. A loop, not forced, not blown by fans or pushed by fire. Just a quiet, never-ending loop powered by gravity, temperature, and patience. When word began to spread that Elias was digging under his own wall like a crazy badger, a few neighbors came to watch. What they saw made no sense to them. He wasn't expanding the cabin. He wasn't reinforcing anything. He wasn't building a root cellar or a storm shelter. All they saw was a grown man knee-deep in a hole, stacking stones in the shadows and smoothing clay like some kind of underground mason. They shook their heads and muttered that he'd taken leave of his senses. But Elias wasn't building madness. He was building a machine, one powered not by wood or coal, but by the steady heartbeat of the earth. By midsummer, the subwall rose from a depth most men wouldn't dare dig to, stretching upward like a buried tower only Elias would ever see. He sealed the chamber at the top with a fitted wooden plank beneath the cabin floor, leaving only the narrow breathing slits that completed the system. To anyone else, it looked like nothing at all. To Elias Harrow, it was the warmest wall he would ever build, one the winter wind would never conquer. The first hint that Elias Harrow's strange construction might actually work came long before winter on a mild September evening. When the air carried that unmistakable edge, summer fading cold, preparing its slow march down from the high ridges. Elias wasn't testing anything yet. He was simply finishing his day's chores when he noticed something unexpected. A draft, but not the usual kind. There, along the narrow slit beneath the north wall, his hidden opening into the deep chamber, he felt a faint pull of air brushing past his fingertips. Not strong, not warm, not cold. Just steady. As if the earth beneath the cabin had begun breathing. Curious, Elias lit a sliver of tallow candle and set it near the opening. The flame tipped not wildly, not like a wind gust, but with purpose. Downward, into the darkness of the chamber he'd carved, cold cabin air being pulled into the sub-wall. He crouched, lower eyes, narrowed, mind turning. If cold air was sinking, then something had to rise. He crossed the room to where the return vent near the hearth sat open, a simple wooden grate built into the lower wall. He placed his palm over it. Warmth. Not heat, not fire warm, but the unmistakable gentleness of air that had touched deep earth. Warm enough to notice. Warm enough to matter. Elias straightened, heart steady but alert, the way a plains hunter reacts when he sees the first sign of a distant herd. The system wasn't roaring to life. It didn't need to. It was moving the way all natural things move, slowly, quietly, without waste. For the first time, the idea that had lived only in his mind and his calloused hands revealed its true nature. The chamber was acting like a standing geothermal tower. Cold air from the cabin, dense and heavy, fell into the hidden recess. As it descended, the deep soil began transferring its stored warmth into the air. Not through flames or glowing coals, but through contact, through patience, through the simple truth that the earth 10 or 20 feet down doesn't care if the night above is turning cruel. By the time the air reached the bottom, it had absorbed enough warmth to rise again, traveling through the angled return vent like sap climbing a tree in spring. Then, ever so lightly, it drifted back into the cabin, lifting the temperature without a single log burning in the hearth. A silent loop. No smoke, no crackle of fire, no frantic feeding of wood. Just a man and the earth working together, the way old farmers once understood. But most trappers had long forgotten. But Elias wanted to be sure. So he tested the balance again and again at dawn. When the cabin was coldest at midday, when the sun warmed the logs, and late at night, when frost whispered against the windows. His crude thermometers showed the same pattern every time. The air emerging from the subwall held steady between 38 degrees and 45 degrees, regardless of surface weather. That number meant everything. 40-degree air isn't warm enough to heat a cabin by itself, but it is warm enough to transform the work required to survive. It meant the fireplace only had to lift the air from 40 degrees to the comfortable mid-60s, not from the bitter negatives the valley endured. It meant each log burned went farther. It meant his cabin would cool slower. It meant winter would no longer be a battle of fire versus frost. It meant Elias had tapped into the quiet warmth of the deep earth. By the time the first real windstorm swept down from the ridge in late October, snow swirling sideways, ice rattling against the shutters, Elias already knew. His subwall wasn't a theory anymore. It was a living part of the cabin, a hidden engine, a buried ally, a piece of the land itself working on his behalf. And when the wind roared hardest and the valley prepared for another season of brutal cold, Elias Harrow sat calm in the glow of a modest fire, knowing he had built something no storm could take from him. The first true test of Elias Harrow's buried invention came earlier than anyone expected. Winter descended on the Bitterroot that year, like an ambush, one of those sudden mountain turns where the morning begins with a gentle mist and ends with the world locked under ice. The sky went white, the wind grew sharp as cut glass, and by sundown, the mercury had fallen past 20 below. Most men in the valley responded in the same way they always had. They threw more logs on their fires, cursed the cold, and tightened the buckskin around their shoulders. Axes thudded into frozen rounds before dawn the next day. Smoke poured from chimneys like distress signals. But Elias did something that left even him uneasy. He didn't change anything. Just before dusk, on that first frigid night, Elias built a fire no larger than what he'd been making in October, a single modest blaze licking up through the hearth, casting warm but gentle light across the cabin. No frantic feeding, no stack of pine splits waiting at the ready, just one steady flame. Then he waited. For men like Elias, waiting was a familiar companion. He'd waited for traps to spring, for storms to pass, for snow to melt off forgotten trails. But this waiting felt different. It felt like a gamble, a test of every hour he'd spent digging, stacking stones, shaping clay, listening to the ground breathe. Outside, the cold pressed in, slow, patient, relentless. The kind of cold that found every crack between the logs and every knot in the wood. A lesser cabin would have chilled within an hour of the fire dying down. Elias knew this from experience. He'd lived it. He'd woken to shivering nights and stiff fingers fighting the cold like a man wrestling a silent enemy. But tonight, something was different. Even as the fire burned low, the air in the cabin held steady. The chill that normally crept up through the floorboards never came. Instead, a faint warmth rose from beneath his boots, the same subtle breath he'd felt in September, now strengthened by the brutal contrast outside. Elias moved to the north wall, the one every trapper dreaded most. He pressed his palm against the logs. They weren't warm, but they weren't icy either. No cabin wall in that valley had ever felt like that in early winter. He checked the thermometer he'd set on the table. The air inside hovered around 60 degrees, comfortable, even pleasant compared to the world beyond the door. Outside was death cold. Inside was steady, not hot, not blazing, just steady. And nothing about steady ever happens by accident in a mountain winter. As the night deepened, wind howled through the pine tops. Snow swept across the clearing like white smoke. Elias sat in his chair, by the fading fire boots propped lightly on the hearth, and listened not to the crackle of wood, but to the silence of a cabin that did not fear the dark. Hours passed. The fire dropped to embers. Any other trapper would have risen 3 times by then to lay more logs on the flames. Elias simply pulled his blanket across his lap and stayed seated. When he finally rose at dawn to open the shutter, a thin crust of frost coated the outside world windows, snowbanks, even the ropes beside the door. But inside, nothing. No frost creeping across the logs, no ice forming along the rafters, no breath clouds lingering in the air. His cabin had held its warmth through one of the harshest opening nights he'd ever known. The buried wall had done its job, and word spread faster than he expected. A neighbor, Jonas Creekmore, stopped by that afternoon, stamping snow from his boots, muttering about the cold and the endless woodcutting. He eyed Elias's woodpile with suspicion. It hadn't shrunk at all since the storm began. "You burning green pine now?" Jonas asked. "Or witchcraft?" Elias only smiled, that quiet half-smile of a man who doesn't brag because the truth speaks loudly enough. "Just burning less," he said. Jonas snorted. "Impossible. Winter like this'll chew through a man's cordwood like a hungry mule." But when Jonas stepped inside and felt that warmth, despite the near-dead fire in the hearth, his words died in his throat. "Lord above," he whispered. "How?" Elias didn't explain. Not yet. The system was too new, too strange, too unbelievable. He wanted more time to observe it, to trust it, to be sure it wasn't a fluke or mercy of early winter. But deep down, beneath the quiet humility and the calloused hands, Elias knew the truth. This winter would be different. This winter belonged to the earth, and his life, perhaps even his neighbor's, would never be the same again. Long before engineers drew diagrams or measured airflow with instruments, men on the frontier learned science the only way they could, by living inside it. They watched how wind curled around a cabin, how snow melted on the south side of a ridge but lingered for weeks on the north, how a creek froze solid except where the current ran deep and slow. No chalkboards, no equations. Just observation repetition, and the quiet certainty that nature always tells the truth if a man pays attention. Elias Harrow understood this instinctively. When he built his subwall, he didn't know the words thermal mass convection loop or ground-coupled heat exchange. But he knew the feeling of the Earth's temperature beneath his boots. He knew how root cellars refused to freeze, even when the wind outside whipped snow into razor-edged drifts. He knew how a shallow cave he once sheltered in during a blizzard had remained surprisingly warm, its air still and constant while the world outside raged. These were not mysteries to him. They were clues, and when winter finally tightened its grip on the Bitterroot Valley, Elias's subwall began revealing the simple science that made it work. 1. The steady heartbeat of deep soil. 20 feet beneath the ground, the Earth doesn't feel winter in the way humans do. It doesn't know blizzards or cold snaps or sudden storms. It holds a steady temperature, usually somewhere around the high 30s to mid-40s Fahrenheit in that part of the Rockies. That number at first glance doesn't seem impressive. But when the air above the ground plunges to 30 below 40-degree Earth, it becomes a gentle reservoir of warmth. A constant. A refuge. Elias had tapped directly into that constancy. 2. Warm air rises. Cold air falls even underground. The hidden chamber behind the north wall acted like a tall, narrow throat. Cold indoor air, denser, heavier, fell naturally into it through the narrow slit at floor level. Once inside, the air pressed against cold soil that grew warmer the deeper it went, absorbing heat molecule by molecule. By the time it reached the deep earth, the air wasn't warm, but it wasn't deadly cold either. It had been softened, pre-tempered, made gentle. From there, its path upward was inevitable. Warm, even slightly warm air wants to rise. So the moment it gathered enough heat from the earth, it drifted upward through the angled return vent, slipping into the cabin again like a quiet exhale. No fans, no pumps, nothing mechanical. Just physics doing what physics has always done. 3. The hidden gift of the zigzag wall. Most men would have dug a straight-sided pit. Simple, easy, fast. Elias shaped his subwall like a series of shallow ridges and folds, increasing the surface area that touched the air. More surface area meant more contact. More contact meant more heat transfer. Without ever knowing the scientific term, Elias intuitively built what modern engineers would call a passive heat exchanger. He didn't need the name. He had the results. 4. The paradox of the north wall. In any cabin, the north wall was the coldest side. Every trapper knew that. Which meant it was the best place to draw cold air down into the earth. Cold air wanted to go there anyway. Elias simply gave it a path. By turning the coldest side of his home into the gateway for heat recovery, he flipped the rules of frontier architecture on their head. 5. A system that worked harder the worse the weather became. This may have been the strangest part. During milder weather, the airflow was slow and subtle. But the colder it got outside, the more cold air entered the cabin. Through natural leakage, the more cold air fell into the sub-wall, and the stronger the convection cycle became. The system worked best when nature was harshest. It fought the cold using the cold's own strength. A cruel night made the airflow faster. A deep freeze made the soil seem warmer. A blizzard drew more earth-warmed air upward. To the trapper mind, this defied common sense. To physics, it was simply the stack effect. Warm air, rising cold air, sinking every breath of the wind, amplifying the cycle. 6. The kind of science mountain. Men didn't trust. Elias knew better than to explain any of this to his neighbors. Most mountain men trusted what they could swing an axe at. They believed in fire because they could see it. Heat from the ground, air moving on its own, a wall that warmed a room. That wasn't science to them. That was sorcery. But Elias understood something they didn't. This was nature helping him rather than resisting him. A cabin that partnered with the land instead of fighting it. A winter strategy based on humility rather than force. A system that used patience instead of labor. And as the winter deepened, the difference between work and wisdom became clearer with every passing night. By midwinter, word had spread far beyond the handful of cabins scattered along the Bitterroot. Men who rarely spoke to one another now shared a common curiosity. Why was Elias Harrow's woodpile still full? In a land where a man measured his survival by the height of his stacked logs, this was no small thing. Every trapper, farmer, and wanderer who passed near Elias's clearing paused to stare. Some whispered, some scoffed, some grew uneasy. Mountain men didn't like mysteries, especially not ones that made them feel like they'd been working harder than they needed to. Before long, small groups began appearing at Elias's door. They pretended they were just passing through looking for news-checking trap lines, anything except admitting what they really wanted to look inside his cabin. The sight baffled them. His fire was modest, a few coals glowing in the hearth. No great roaring flames, no frantic chopping of wood outside. The air inside was warm, not hot, but comfortable, steady, the kind of heat that didn't punch you in the face when you walked in, but settled around you like an old wool blanket. They looked around, frowning, searching for a hidden stove, a coal burner, a second hearth, anything that made sense, and found nothing visible anyway. When Elias finally told the first curious neighbor, a grizzled trapper named Samuel Ridge, that the warmth came from a chamber beneath the cabin, Sam stared at him like he'd grown antlers. From the ground, Sam spat a wad of tobacco into the snow. The ground's colder than the devil's handshake. Elias only shrugged. Not deep down. Sam shook his head. You'll forgive me, friend, but that sounds like nonsense. And that response right there was why Elias's idea never spread. 1. The frontier mind was practical, not experimental. Most mountain men trusted experience above all else. If they hadn't seen it, touched it, or bled because of it, they didn't believe it. Fire kept you warm. Earth was cold. End of story. Trying something new required a kind of imagination that felt dangerous. On the frontier, danger was not an academic concern. 2. Digging was harder than cutting wood. A man could fell a tree in minutes. He could split a cord in an afternoon. But digging a trench 10, 15, 20 feet deep through frozen ground alone, to most trappers that sounded like madness. Even if it worked, the labor up front felt impossible. Cutting wood was awful but familiar. Digging into the earth was awful and unknown. 3. Pride is a heavy wall. Mountain men weren't the type to admit they might have overlooked something simple. If Elias's method was better, it implied they'd been wasting years of backbreaking labor. And pride, especially frontier pride, doesn't take kindly to being contradicted. Better to dismiss the idea than to accept that a quiet man had outsmarted the whole valley. 4. Fear of collapse. A chamber under the cabin. To them that sounded like inviting death. What if it caved in? What if the whole cabin sank? What if poisonous air rose up from the earth? Elias tried explaining that he'd reinforced everything, like a mine shaft, that the air was clean. Not that the chamber wasn't under the living area, but alongside it. Didn't matter. Fear speaks louder than facts. 5. Survival leaves little room for innovation. When a man's days were consumed with trapping repairing gear, guarding food stores, and preparing for storms, he had no time left for experiments. Innovation takes time and faith. Winter survival left little of either. Men did what they knew because doing what they didn't know might kill them. 6. Elias's success was too subtle. If his cabin had been blazing warm, glowing like a blacksmith's forge, maybe the valley would have paid attention. But Elias's system didn't create dramatic heat. It created stable heat. Gentle warmth. Dry floors. Walls that didn't sweat frost. The very things that made his invention brilliant also made it invisible. 7. The frontier distrusted anything that didn't require suffering. There was a strange belief among the mountain men, a belief passed quietly from one generation to the next. If something didn't hurt, it probably wouldn't work. Warmth in their minds had to be earned the hard way. Frozen hands, sore backs, endless chopping. The idea that the earth might give warmth freely unthinkable. And so Elias's system remained a curiosity, not a revolution. A few men believed him, fewer understood him. None copied him. They respected him, yes. Admired his steady nerves, his quiet manner, his uncanny way of observing the land. But admiration is not adoption. The valley went on splitting cords of wood, while Elias lived in quiet comfort, burning less, resting more, listening to the winter winds batter the other cabins, while his own breathed calmly with the earth. And in that silence, Elias understood something deeper than any man had spoken aloud. People don't reject better ideas because they don't work. They reject them because the ideas ask them to change, and change in the wilderness feels far more frightening than cold. The winter of 1842 did not arrive gently. It slammed into the Bitterroot like a falling mountain, sudden, crushing, silent, in the way only deadly things can be. The elders would later call it the Starvation Blizzard, a name whispered with the same gravity reserved for battles and funerals. It was the kind of winter that tested the limits of every cabin, every stockpile, every man's resolve. The cold came first. A cold so sharp it split logs left outdoors and made leather stiffen like forged iron. The temperature dropped past 40 below, then settled there as if daring the valley to endure it. Men's beards froze white while they were still standing near their hearths. Water buckets hardened into solid blocks overnight, even when kept by the fire. Then came the wind, a long, unbroken scream that barreled down from the high passes, carrying snow so fine and furious it felt like ground glass on the skin. It piled against cabin walls in drifts taller than a man. It swallowed trails. It buried trap lines. It erased the world outside the front door. And then, worst of all, the wood began to run out. Cabin after cabin found their carefully stacked winter stores shrinking faster than anyone anticipated. A cord that normally lasted a week burned down in 2 days. Men who had boasted in autumn about their 7-cord piles were left staring at half a stack by mid-January. No one dared venture far for more. The wind alone could disorient a man so completely that he'd wander in circles until he fell into the frozen dark. Fear settled over the valley like a second snow. Families huddled inside cabins that grew colder by the hour. Frost crept up walls from the floorboards. Ice formed crystals on the inside of window frames. Breath hung in the air like smoke. Some burned furniture. Some tore apart shed walls. Others, too proud to admit desperation, waited too long. But there was one place in the valley where warmth still lived. Elias Harrow's cabin glowed softly through the storm, steady, calm, unchanged. Inside the hearth fire was small, barely more than a cluster of glowing coals. Yet the air remained comfortable. Not hot, not summer warm, but human warm. Breath didn't freeze. Water didn't crust with ice. His children slept without shivering. And every time the wind roared against the logs, the cabin answered with the same quiet pulse rising from the sub-wall beneath the floorboards. Earth-warmed air, a buried heartbeat. The one warmth winter could not steal. On the 5th night of the blizzard, when even the bravest men had surrendered to fear, Elias heard a pounding on his door, weak, dull, nearly swallowed by the storm. He opened it to find Jonas Creekmore and the same neighbor who'd scoffed at his witchcraft. Jonas's beard was frozen solid. His hands barely worked. Behind him stood his wife and 2 young boys, pale and shaking. "We're out of wood," Jonas said through chattering teeth. His voice cracked on the last word. "Please." Elias didn't hesitate. "Get inside." He cleared space near the hearth, laid down blankets, gave them warm broth. Within hours, 2 more families came. Then another. Soon 17 people were crowded into Elias's cabin. Men, women, children pressed shoulder to shoulder, occupying every inch of floor and bench and bed. And through it all, the cabin held. The small fire remained small. The walls held their warmth. The frost never crept inward. The deeper the cold outside, the harder the sub-wall worked, breathing warmth in slow, steady cycles, as if the earth itself had taken responsibility for these lives. Some of the men looked around the cabin with a mixture of awe and shame. "This shouldn't be possible," one whispered. "It ain't the fire keeping us alive." No, another answered quietly, nodding toward Elias. "It's the ground." For the first time, they truly understood what he had built. Not magic, not luck, not rebellion against nature, but partnership with it. When the storm finally ended 2 weeks later, when the valley crawled out of its frozen shell and counted its losses, Elias's cabin became something of a legend. Some called it providence. Some called it a miracle. Others called it stubborn genius. But everyone remembered one thing. 17 people walked into that cabin with frost in their lungs. And 17 walked out alive. The earth had given what fire alone could not. And from that winter on, no one in the valley ever laughed at Elias Harrow's buried wall again. After the Starvation Blizzard passed, and the valley slowly crawled back into motion, something unexpected happened. People talked, not about traps or beaver prices or who had lost the most cattle. They talked about Elias Harrow's cabin, about the warmth inside it, about the 17 souls who lived through the storm because of it, about the strange, quiet way the earth itself had become part of the home. But talking is not the same as building. Spring thaw arrived. The snow retreated slowly from the valley floor. Men returned to their trap lines. Families repaired roofs, sharpened tools, replanted gardens. Life resumed its usual rhythm, a rhythm that left little room for new ideas, no matter how miraculous they seemed in the moment. A few trappers visited Elias and asked questions, serious questions. How deep did you dig? What kind of stone? How'd you keep it from collapsing? Could a man build one without tearing up his whole cabin? Elias explained, patient and plain-spoken. He even walked them to the outer edge of the wall, showing the slight rise in the ground, where he had dumped soil from the excavation. But as he described the effort, the months of digging, the precision of the stonework, the careful sealing of vents, he saw something flicker in their eyes. Not doubt, weariness. These were men who spent their lives chasing pelts, outrunning storms, patching gear, raising children, praying their wood piles held out. The idea of devoting a full summer to digging a deep trench just to save winter labor felt indulgent, luxurious, unrealistic. It wasn't that they didn't believe it worked. It was that life didn't give them space to reinvent themselves. And so gradually, the valley did what frontier communities always did. It returned to the familiar. By 1845, only one man, an eager young trapper named Henry Calder, attempted a partial version of Elias's design. He dug a 7-foot trench behind his cabin and stacked rough stones against the soil. It helped a little, but not enough. He hadn't gone deep. The chamber was too shallow. The wall lacked the contact needed to create real convection. When winter came, he needed almost as much firewood as before. Others heard of Henry's poor results and assumed Elias's original system had been exaggerated by rumor. And just like that, curiosity turned into skepticism. Meanwhile, the world was changing. 1. The fur trade collapsed. By the late 1840s, beaver populations dwindled. Prices crashed. Most trappers left the mountains for Oregon, California, or the new gold rumors spreading east of the Rockies. Cabins were abandoned. Trails grew over. The valley emptied out. Elias stayed. He had no desire to chase new fortunes. But the people who might have carried his idea elsewhere scattered. Knowledge cannot spread if the people who hold it disappear. 2. Farmers and settlers didn't understand mines. By the 1850s, the Bitterroot was gradually repopulated, not by trappers, but by farmers, ranchers, and homesteaders. Good people, hard-working people, but not men who had spent years underground. They knew soil for planting, not digging. Wells, not chambers. Barns, not subwalls. When Elias tried explaining his earth-warmed wall, they nodded politely and changed the subject. To them, the idea felt foreign. Too much like tunneling, too much like engineering, too risky for families who could barely afford a single winter mistake. 3. New technology arrived. Railroads crept closer. Cast iron stoves became more available. Coal began to appear at trading posts. People embraced these innovations because they were easy, because they didn't require digging 20 feet into frozen ground, because they fit neatly into the lives settlers already understood. Hard work done all at once, like Elias's system, was less appealing than smaller work done every day. Depth versus convenience, and convenience usually wins. 4. Elias himself never promoted the idea. Elias Harrow was a quiet man, the kind who avoided crowds, disliked attention, and never claimed to know more than the next fellow. He didn't write down instructions. He didn't preach the philosophy of earth heat. If someone asked, he'd explain plainly, but only if they asked. Innovation rarely survives without a champion, and Elias was not the type to stand on a stump and shout about his creation. 5. The cabin faded, but the wall endured. By the 1870s, long after his children grew and the valley began filling with new families, Elias's cabin still stood. Weathered, gray, leaning, but warm. Always warm. Even when the roof began to sag, the subwall continued breathing cold nights, hot days, spring rains, summer dust. The earth remained faithful in its work, long after the men who once marveled at it had died or moved on. When Elias himself passed in 1886, at the age of 72, his cabin remained exactly as he left it. His oldest son maintained it for a decade, his grandson another 10. But by the turn of the century, the last Harrows had moved closer to town. The cabin was abandoned. By 1912, it was more bones than home. Moss grew between the logs. Snow pushed the roof inward. Trees encroached. The chimney tilted dangerously to one side. But the subwall, when surveyors evaluated the old homestead, they were astonished. The chamber still stood. The stonework still clean. The airflow still present a faint upward draft that defied its age. A century-old machine quietly running in the dark. A piece of knowledge too advanced for the world that birthed it, and too simple for later generations to appreciate. And so the design drifted into legend, a whisper, a rumor, a forgotten accomplishment of a quiet man who listened to the earth more carefully than most people listen to each other. Not lost because it failed, but because no one else bothered to dig. Long after Elias Harrow's cabin sank into memory, after its logs fell inward, after the forest reclaimed the clearing, after the last Harrow child moved into town, and the lesson hidden beneath that cabin still lived on in the soil. The earth does not forget what men ignore. It keeps its patterns, its temperatures, its quiet steadiness. And if there is one thing the frontier teaches better than any schoolbook, it is this: survival begins with understanding, not with force. Fire can warm a man. Work can save him. But wisdom is what lets him thrive. As the decades rolled forward and the world transformed steam engines, telegraphs, railroads, electricity, the simple truth Elias discovered waited patiently for someone else to notice. A few engineers rediscovered it in the 1970s, calling it ground-coupled heat exchange. Off-grid builders revived it again in the 1990s, naming it earth tubes and passive geothermal. And today people in the sustainable living movement speak of it with a kind of reverence, as if it were a modern revelation. But the truth is older, much older. A man with cracked hands and a quiet mind was living it in 1842. 1. Nature solves problems better than we do. Elias didn't try to overpower winter. He didn't rage against it or declare war on it the way other mountain men did. He didn't cut wood until his back buckled or build fires so large they turned his cabin into a furnace. He studied the cold, then studied the ground, and let the earth do what it had always done. He worked with nature instead of against it. Modern off-grid homesteaders often rediscover this truth the hard way. Solar panels fail under heavy snow. Fuel prices spike. Generators break. But the ground never forgets its own warmth. 2. Upfront labor saves years of exhaustion. Most men rejected Elias's idea because it was heavy work done once massive effort with little immediate reward. They preferred smaller tasks, repeated endlessly cutting wood every day, hauling it every morning, burning it every night. There's a lesson in that. People avoid big changes, even when those changes free them for the rest of their lives. Elias spent one summer digging. He saved 30 winters of labor. That ratio is worth remembering. 3. Good ideas die without champions. Had Elias been a louder man, had he been the kind to lecture, persuade, demonstrate, maybe his method would have spread across the Rockies. Maybe every cabin from Idaho to Wyoming would have breathed warm air from the earth. Instead, he shared his knowledge quietly, sparingly, only when asked. Good ideas are fragile that way. Frontier history is full of lost inventions, stoves tools, building tricks, because their creators never wrote anything down. Elias's earth-warmed wall is one of them. It existed. It worked. It saved lives. And still it vanished for nearly a century. 4. Comfort doesn't always require more. Sometimes it requires less. Modern people often believe warmth comes from increasing effort. More insulation, more heat, more equipment. Elias learned the opposite. Comfort can come from subtraction, from stability, from lowering the struggle rather than increasing the fight. His cabin wasn't hot. It was balanced, not powerful, simply efficient, not a fortress, a partnership. 5. The deep earth is a teacher. Today, off-grid builders talk about thermal mass passive heating, geothermal stability. Elias experienced all of this without ever naming it. He didn't need the terminology. He learned by kneeling in soil, touching the ground, observing. That humility, listening before acting, is something we lose in modern life. The earth is older than our mistakes, older than our technologies, older than every storm we fear. It has answers if we pause long enough to feel them. 6. The quietest innovations are often the strongest. Elias's system had no moving parts, no metal, no machinery, no noise. It breathed like a living thing, slow, patient, effortless. Modern engineering spends billions trying to replicate what a single man built with a shovel stones and stubborn curiosity. And in many ways, they still haven't improved on it. 7. Legacy isn't always in the things we leave behind. By the time surveyors examined the Harrow cabin in the early 1900s, they found the wooden walls collapsing and the chimney cracked, the roof half fallen. But the stone chamber Elias built, it stood firm. Air still rose from it. A faint warmth still pulsed upward. His logs had died, but his idea had not. Legacy is not always a monument. Sometimes it's a principle, a truth waiting for rediscovery. The modern frontier. Today, as more Americans seek independence, building cabins, installing off-grid systems, returning to the land, Elias Harrow's buried wall feels less like a relic and more like a roadmap. A reminder that the frontier wasn't just hardship. It was ingenuity. That survival wasn't just strength. It was insight. That warmth wasn't just fire. It was understanding. If Elias could speak now, he wouldn't claim genius. He'd simply say, "The earth gives more than it takes if you're willing to dig a little." And maybe that's the truest lesson of all, because somewhere out there beneath the frost line, Warmth is still waiting steady, ancient, and patient for whoever is wise enough to reach for it. When people tell stories about the old frontier, they often speak of the dangers, the wolves, the winters, the loneliness, the storms. But the truth is, the frontier was just as full of quiet brilliance as it was of hardship. Men like Elias Harrow weren't scholars or engineers. They weren't designing inventions for fame or crafting theories for textbooks. They were simply solving the problem of living one breath, one winter, one observation at a time. And maybe that's why his story matters now. Because in a world drowning in information, where solutions come packaged in instruction manuals and glowing screens, Elias found his answers in the oldest teacher we have, at the ground beneath his feet. Not in defiance of nature, but in partnership with it. His cabin is gone now. The logs rotted. The chimney toppled. The clearing closed in under pine and willow. But the lesson remains steady as bedrock. That sometimes the smartest solutions are the simplest. That the earth holds warmth even when the world above turns cruel. That survival favors those who observe, rather than panic, who adapt, rather than fight, who find opportunity in the places most people overlook. Elias never imagined that future generations would rediscover his idea and build entire homes based on the same quiet principle. He wasn't trying to shape the future. He was just trying to get through another winter. Yet wisdom often begins that way, with one person paying closer attention than everyone else. And so, as this story settles in your mind, I invite you to remember one thing. Innovation isn't always loud. Ingenuity doesn't always come wrapped in machinery. And the greatest warmth we find in this life sometimes rises from places we rarely think to search. If you're building your own off-grid haven someday, if you're dreaming of a cabin far from the noise, if you're seeking a gentler way to live with the land, think of Elias Harrow. Think of his quiet mind, his calloused hands, his strange buried wall. Think of the night when 17 people survived a blizzard because one man believed the ground could help him. And remember this simple frontier truth: the earth is never silent, only waiting for someone willing to listen.